Hey there. Tonight, we begin with a house that should not have been there at all, resting in black water off the coast of Turkey, its walls still holding their shape as if the sea had only just stepped over them. When the cameras drifted close, they did not find a broken ship or a scatter of lost cargo. They found a room made with woven branches and packed mud, a human room, sitting where dry ground used to breathe. And that would already be enough to keep a person awake. But then the old Sumerian tablets are lifted into the same pool of light, and suddenly the story becomes stranger. Those tablets speak of cities before a flood, cities built in a sacred pattern, cities abandoned when the waters came. If this quiet ruin under the Black Sea is part of that same memory, then what sank there was not just a shoreline. It may have been a piece of the first world people ever tried to remember. If this kind of long night story is your sort of shelter, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It helps keep these strange old trails open. Now, settle in. Let the room grow softer around you. Loosen the day from your shoulders just a little, and come with me to the edge of a sea that was once a lake. In the year 2000, a research vessel called Northern Horizon sat over dark water, roughly 12 miles from the coast near Sinop. The sea below was cold, layered, secretivi. Robert Ballard was on board. Already famous for finding wrecks most people only knew from headlines and legends, and his team was doing what patient people do when they know the earth still keeps records long after nations forget them. They lowered cameras into the blackness and let machines move where lungs and nerves could not go. For a while, the screen showed only that familiar underwater loneliness, particles drifting like dust in a locked room, a floor of sediment without expression, light falling from the camera in a narrow beam, then fading almost immediately into ink. If you were standing there with me, you would hear the little sounds of research, the quiet voices, the electrical hum, somebody shifting in a chair, somebody leaning closer without realizing it. Discovery rarely begins with trumpets. Usually, it begins with one person saying, very softly, "Wait." Then the shape appeared. Not random, not natural, not one more tease from stone and shadow. The lines were too deliberate. A wall, an angle, a rectangular outline, something made by hands that had understood shelter, proportion, and weather. The cameras moved carefully, and the structure became clearer. It had once stood on dry land. It had once held air. It had once known footsteps, voices, perhaps a cooking fire, perhaps a child leaning against the threshold while morning light came in from the waterside. Now it sat under about 90 meters of sea, preserved by darkness and the peculiar chemistry of the deep Black Sea. The walls were made with woven branches and mud, a construction method so old and so practical that it feels almost intimate. Wattle and daub, thin sticks crossed and bent into place, then sealed with earth until a wall emerged out of patience itself. Nearby lay stone tools, ceramics, polished stone vessels. Nothing extravagant. No gold. No theatrical treasure. Just the kind of objects that whisper something more haunting than riches ever do. We lived here. We built here. This was once normal. And then It was not. The dates mattered. Radiocarbon work on shells from that drowned shoreline placed human occupation there around 7,000 years ago, around the 5th millennium before the Common Era, maybe earlier. Ballard and his team published what they had found. Newspapers noticed briefly. Archaeologists read with interest and caution. Then the usual thing happened. The world moved on to brighter noise. The structure stayed where it was, below the water, carrying its own silence like a sealed jar. Honestly, I have always found it strange that the loudest discoveries are not always the deepest ones. Sometimes a thing is too old, too cold, too difficult to fit into the modern appetite for certainty, so it gets placed gently to one side. The report is filed. The object remains. The question waits. And the question grew sharper because this sea had not always been a sea. Long before ships crossed the Black Sea, long before empires argued over its coasts, the basin may have been a lower freshwater lake cut off from the Mediterranean. Rivers fed it from every direction. Shorelines stretched where there is only water now. Wetlands breathed there. People settled there. They built at the edge of the water because people almost always do. Water gives fish, reeds, birds, travel, reflection, rhythm. Water also creates the most dangerous kind of trust. It makes a place feel permanent right until it does not. Geologists in the late 20th century argued that the Black Sea basin was catastrophically flooded when Mediterranean water broke through the Bosphorus and poured in. That idea has been debated, refined, challenged, defended. Some scholars think the flooding was abrupt. Some think it was slower. Some dispute the exact timing. But a few things remain stubborn. Large portions of what is now seafloor were once land. Human beings were on that land. The water rose. Shorelines drowned. Now hold that image for a moment, a drowning shoreline, and let another image come toward it from very far away. In southern Iraq, between the Tigris and Euphrates, scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay. The land there is flat in a way that almost feels ceremonial. Sky dominates. River light spreads thin and pale over mud and reeds. This was Sumer, or what would later be called Sumer, the earliest known world of cities and tablets and official memory. These people kept records with an intensity that still feels almost unnerving. Grain allocations, livestock counts, hymns, laws, city lists, medical texts, flood narratives. They wrote because they feared loss, or perhaps because they already knew too much about it. Who exactly the Sumerians were in the oldest sense remains unsettled. Their language is an isolate, a linguistic stranger without a confirmed family nearby. That uncertainty matters because it leaves a small door open in the mind. They appear in the historical record already bearing sophisticated systems, already building, already counting, already writing themselves into permanence. They are not a people who stroll into view with empty hands. At Nippur, archaeologists uncovered vast tablet archives, tens of thousands of them. If you imagine that scene for a moment, it is almost impossibly moving. Workers brushing away debris in the Mesopotamian sun. crates being filled, broken pieces of clay lifted from silence, a temple archive reappearing after ages of burial. More than 60,000 pieces from one city. That is not a culture casually acquainted with writing. That is a civilization trying very hard not to forget itself. Among the most significant texts recovered from that wide scribal world is a damaged tablet, now famous under the name Eridu Genesis. It is not complete. Time has taken bites out of it. Whole sections are missing. Sentences break off. There are gaps where the clay no longer carries what the stylus once pressed into it. Yet enough remains to feel the shape of the lost whole. The text speaks of humanity, kingship, the founding of cities, and then a flood. I have always loved and feared broken tablets. A perfect object can feel distant, almost too polished to touch with the imagination. A broken one feels like a survivor. It has passed through more than one danger. It comes to us incomplete, which is perhaps the most honest way for very old truth to arrive. In the surviving lines of the Eridu Genesis, the establishment of the earliest cities is described in an ordered sequence. The cities are named, allotted, given meaning. They do not emerge like accidents. They are set into place as if according to a plan older than the people who will live within them. First comes Eridu, then Bad Tibira, then Larak, then Sipper, then Shuruppak. 5 cities. Not a vague landscape of forgotten settlements, but a specific chain, one after another. And after that sequence, the text reaches its quiet break in the world. Then the flood swept over. Such a small sentence, such enormous damage inside it. You know that feeling when a person tells you something terrible in a perfectly level voice, and the calm makes it worse. That is what this line is like. No ornament, no screaming, no theatrical sky, just the record of a boundary. Before this, cities. After this, something else. What makes the line more unsettling is that the Sumerians did not separate these pre-flood entries from later history the way modern people like to separate myth from fact. Their king lists run from antediluvian rulers into later dynasties without changing tone. The same administrative style, the same formal structure, the same air of ledger and legitimacy. Yes, the reign lengths before the flood are impossible in literal terms. Fantastically long, clearly encoding something other than ordinary human lifespan. Scholars are right to point that out. But the cities themselves are real. Archaeologists dug Eridu. They dug Shuruppak. They found them. They mapped them. These were not invented stage sets. So the problem becomes harder, not easier. If the cities are real, and the texts remember them as pre-flood cities abandoned when the waters came, what exactly is being remembered? A story, a symbol, a political fiction, a broken historical memory. Some scholars argue for literary construction, and that argument deserves respect. Others think the texts preserve encoded memory of a genuine catastrophe, transformed by centuries of oral transmission before it reached clay. We cannot be sure, But once the underwater Black Sea structure enters the conversation, the old tablets stop sounding comfortably distant, because now two kinds of evidence lean toward one another across the dark. On one side, clay and museum light. On the other, a drowned building in camera glow. On one side, 5 cities before a flood. On the other, proof that people once lived where only deep water now exists. On one side, a line in Sumerian saying the flood swept over. On the other, a shoreline that really was swept over, whether abruptly or in terrible stages. The fit is not perfect. It is not supposed to be perfect. Deep history almost never is. But the overlap is strong enough to make the mind quiet itself and pay attention. And that is where I want this first stretch of the night to rest. With the vessel above black water, the cameras still pointed downward, and the tablets laid open under museum light in another part of the world. We have not yet said what happened. We are not going to rush into certainty, because certainty is often what ruins a good investigation. For now, it is enough to know that a human structure lies under the Black Sea where dry land used to be, and that the oldest written flood traditions on Earth speak of cities built before water erased them. The sea below the ship is calm at the surface. The room on the vessel is warm with monitors and low voices. Somewhere far away, in Philadelphia, in Oxford, in London, clay tablets rest behind glass or in drawers, carrying old lines in wedge-shaped marks. And between the water and the clay, a narrow bridge is beginning to appear. If the ruin under the sea is only a drowned house, that is already extraordinary. But if it belongs to a larger lost pattern, if what vanished there once followed the same sacred order later remembered in Sumer, then the next step is obvious. We have to go to the people who remembered everything, to the flat riverland where cities first learned to write their own names, and listen to what they said had existed before the flood came and took one world away. The land between the rivers does not announce itself with mountains. It does something quieter and, in its own way, stranger. It keeps opening outward. The horizon in southern Iraq has a way of making human beings feel both important and very small. Mud, reeds, flat light, a sky so large it almost feels structural, as if it were the true architecture, and the ground below were only its patient floor. This was the world of the Sumerians, or at least the world where we first meet them with names. Tablets, temples, and cities. They wrote Guandon mysterious even now. Their language does not sit comfortably inside any known family. It stands alone. Their earliest urban life appears ancient as soon as it becomes visible. By the late 4th millennium before the Common Era, they are already using writing in a systematic way. First, for administration. Yes. Grain. Labor. Animals. Deliveries. The sort of things civilization must count before it can dream. But almost immediately the counting becomes something else. Songs. Laws. Origin stories. Medical instructions. Lists of kings. Lists of cities. Prayers. Flood accounts. It is as if the moment writing arrives, memory rushes into it. That matters because these were not people jotting down passing fancies for entertainment. They were record keepers in the deepest sense. They worked inside temple institutions that served as centers of learning, storage, ritual, and political gravity. Clay tablets dried, hardened, survived fires, collapses, dynasties, wars. A thought pressed into wet earth in 1 century could outlive empires and look up at a museum ceiling 4,000 years later. At Nippur, the sacred city of Enlil, archaeologists recovered tens of thousands of these tablets and fragments from excavations beginning in the late 19th century. If you imagine that scene for a moment, it is almost impossibly moving. Workers brushing away debris in the Mesopotamian sun, crates being filled, broken pieces of clay lifted from silence, a temple archive reappearing after ages of burial. More than 60,000 pieces from one city. That is not a culture casually acquainted with writing. That is a civilization trying very hard not to forget itself. Among the most significant texts recovered from that wide scribal world is a damaged tablet, now famous under the name Eridu Genesis. It is not complete. Time has taken bites out of it. Whole sections are missing. Sentences break off. There are gaps where the clay no longer carries what the stylus once pressed into it. Yet enough remains to feel the shape of the lost whole. The text speaks of humanity, kingship, the founding of cities, and then a flood. I have always loved and feared broken tablets. A perfect object can feel distant, almost too polished to touch with the imagination. A broken one feels like a survivor. It has passed through more than one danger. It comes to us incomplete, which is perhaps the most honest way for very old truth to arrive. In the surviving lines of the Eridu Genesis, the establishment of the earliest cities is described in an ordered sequence. The cities are named, allotted, given meaning. They do not emerge like accidents. They are set into place as if according to a plan older than the people who will live within them. First comes Eridu, then Bad Tibira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. 5 cities, not a vague landscape of forgotten settlements, but a specific chain, one after another. And after that sequence, the text reaches its quiet break in the world. Then the flood swept over. Such a small sentence, such enormous damage inside it. You know that feeling when a person tells you something terrible in a perfectly level voice, and the calm makes it worse. That is what this line is like. Non-lament. No screaming. No theatrical sky. Just the record of a boundary. Before this, cities. After this, something else. What makes the line more unsettling is that the Sumerians did not separate these pre-flood entries from later history the way modern people like to separate myth from fact. Their king lists run from antediluvian rulers into later dynasties without changing tone. The same administrative style, the same formal structure, the same air of ledger and legitimacy. Yes, the reign lengths before the flood are impossible in literal terms. Fantastically long, clearly encoding something other than ordinary human lifespan. Scholars are right to point that out. But the cities themselves are real. Archaeologists dug Eridu. They dug Shuruppak. They found them. They mapped them. These were not invented stage sets. And then there is the clay prism in Oxford. It is small enough that a modern person could imagine lifting it with 2 careful hands, and yet it carries a world. 4 sides, dense wedge marks, a rotating record of kingship before and after catastrophe. I like to picture the museum light on its surface, soft and almost respectful, because some objects seem to demand a slower kind of seeing. The prism does not shout its importance. It simply waits. And when read, it gives the same old sequence of the pre-flood world, then the same dividing line. Then the flood swept over. After that, kingship descends again into the world we can recognize more easily. That phrase matters more the longer you sit with it. Kingship descends again. Not simply continues. Not resumes without interruption. Descends again. It is the language of something broken and reinstalled, something lost and restored from above, or at least from beyond ordinary human reach. Even if we strip away every supernatural layer and keep only the human core, the structure of the memory remains. There was a before, then a rupture, then a second beginning. The more one listens to these old records, the less they feel like decorative mythology and the more they feel like inherited testimony. Real families, real priesthoods, real city traditions often remember disaster that way. Not as a neat event folded inside ordinary time, but as a cut. Before the water, after the water, before the burning, after the silence. The Sumerian tablets carry exactly that kind of wound in their grammar. Now, the careful scholarly objection still stands. Some historians think the antediluvian section was built backward by later scribes who wanted their own dynasties to look ancient and divinely anchored. That may explain some of the inflated numbers. It may explain some of the grand tone, but it does not erase the persistence of the city sequence itself. It does not explain away why these traditions keep circling real places, real names, real temple sites dug from the Mesopotamian plain. This is the point in the story where the atmosphere changes from intrigue to pressure. Because once the names refuse to disappear, the geography starts asking to be taken seriously. Eridu is not just a word on clay. It is a mound in Iraq. Shuruppak is not just the setting of a flood hero. It is a tell excavated by archaeologists who found real occupation layers. Sippar is not just a symbolic solar city. It is a documented urban center. The story is no longer floating. It is touching soil. And yet the soil may not be enough, because another possibility begins whispering at the edge of things. What if the Sumerians preserved not only the memory of these cities in the lowlands, but the memory of an even older drowned world behind them? Not a perfect memory, not a map folded neatly through millennia, more like a transmitted sacred pattern that later cities inherited. A sequence, a way of founding, a conviction that the first true cities belonged to a world before the waters crossed over it. You can feel that possibility growing when you read how seriously the Sumerians treated foundations. Not just walls, but foundations, origins, first places. They cared about where a temple stood and why it stood there. They cared about continuity with the earliest pattern, one generation built over another. and another over that. But the sacred spot remained. The building could perish. The place retained meaning. That habit of mind becomes even more important when we get to Eridu itself. Because Eridu was not simply old. It was old in layers. The first city in the lists became, in archaeology, one of the deepest and most revealing sites in southern Iraq. Excavators found multiple levels of sacred building there, one on top of another, generation after generation choosing to return to the same point in the landscape. The same point. That is how memory behaves when it becomes ritual. It does not merely remember, it rebuilds. If you were standing here with me, I would probably place another log on the fire right around now, because this is where the story starts feeling less like a line and more like a web. The drowned Black Sea structure suggests a lost shoreline world. The Sumerian texts preserve a sequence of pre-flood cities. The king lists treat the flood as a civilizational break. The archaeological record confirms the cities were real. And all of it is stitched together by a culture obsessed with preserving beginnings. No, we still do not have proof that the Black Sea ruin and the Sumerian pre-flood memory are one and the same thing. That would be too easy, and history is almost never that generous. But I've always found it a little funny, in a dry and human way, that modern people sometimes demand a kind of impossible neatness from ancient evidence. They want the sea to hand up a perfectly labeled sign saying, yes, this was one of the 5 cities. Thank you for your patience. The past is not that polite. It leaves fragments. Then it watches what kind of mind we bring to them. And the fragments we have are strong enough to keep going. The Sumerians remembered the first cities with names and order. They preserved them in clay. They carried the flood as a dividing wound in text after text. The Black Sea preserves a drowned structure where dry life once stood. Between them lies a silence full of possibility. I want to leave you here, not with a conclusion, but with a room in the deep sea, made of woven branches and mud. A room in a temple archive, shelves crowded with tablets. A room in the mind of a Sumerian scribe, copying old names because old names still mattered. These rooms do not yet merge completely, but they are beginning to face one another. The vessel above the Black Sea is still waiting in the dark. The clay tablets are still waiting in their drawers and cases. And now our path narrows toward the first city itself, Eridu, where the sacred pattern of building, water, and memory becomes so clear that the drowned house under the sea starts to look less like an isolated ruin and more like the beginning of a lost grammar. That grammar is what we have to follow next. Because if civilization in the Sumerian imagination was not invented from nothing but received, handed down, carried, preserved, and rebuilt, then the survivors of a flood would not need to bring every brick with them. They would only need to remember the pattern well enough to begin again. Eridu sits low in the south, where the old land of Sumer thins into marsh, Ariet, shallow water, and that peculiar trembling horizon that makes distance feel softer than it is. If you travel there in the imagination, not as a tourist with a camera, but as someone listening for old foundations, the first thing you notice is not grandeur. It is patience. The site does not rise like a mountain city. It gathers itself in layers, mud brick upon mud brick, shrine upon shrine, generation after generation returning to one point as if the ground itself had once spoken there and could not be ignored. Excavators in the 20th century cut into that mound and found what the Sumerian memory had promised in its own quiet way. Deep below the later ruins stood earlier sacred levels, 18 major temple phases at least, each built over what came before. A temple sequence so old and so deliberate that it almost feels like a pulse made visible. The earliest level was small, unimpressive by imperial standards. A humble sanctuary, really, but that is part of what makes it affecting. Great cities do not begin as monuments. They begin as focus. A room, an altar. A decision to return to the same patch of earth because something about it has become non-negotiable. I have always thought that this is where archaeology becomes almost emotional, though archaeologists themselves are often too disciplined to say it that way. You lower yourself through the levels of Eridu, and the place starts behaving less like a ruin and more like memory stacked into clay. Later walls do not erase earlier ones. They lean on them. They inherit them. A sacred geometry persists even as the visible building changes. It is like watching a sentence rewritten in different centuries without changing its core meaning. And what was Eridu? In the old Sumerian imagination, not merely a city, not merely a political center, but the first city, the city of Enki, lord of the deep fresh water beneath the earth, keeper of craft, wisdom, and civilizational order. In the texts, Eridu is tied to the Apsu, the hidden waters below creation, not destructive water, but generative depth, the kind of water from which order might emerge. That link matters more than it first appears. This first city is not imagined as rising in isolation from dry dust. It is imagined at the edge of sacred water, receiving form from it. So when the surviving lines of the Eridu Genesis list the first cities before the flood, the sequence is doing more than naming locations. It is naming stations in an inherited design. Eridu first, then Bad Tibira, then Larak, then Sibir, then Shuruppak. The order feels administrative. Yes, but also ceremonial. One after another, as if a template is being unfolded across a landscape. Now imagine that beside the Black Sea structure again. A built space near water, preserved under layers of later silence. Nothing in the structure itself proves temple function. Nothing in Ballard Report says this was sacred architecture. And we should not pretend it does. Some scholars would quite rightly warn us against reaching too fast from one drowned building to the first city of Sumer. That caution is sound. But caution does not forbid pattern recognition. It only asks that we keep our hands steady. The pattern is this. A shoreline world drowns. Much later, the oldest urban tradition we possess remembers first cities as if city making itself belonged to a before world. Not simply villages developing gradually, but named centers standing in a sequence before catastrophe. The temptation is to flatten that into either pure myth or pure fact. The more honest path is slower. The Sumerian material may be preserving a sacred memory of urban order that had to be rebuilt after disaster. Whether that disaster was one flood or many layers of remembered flood is precisely the question. Eridu itself seems to encourage that question. The temple levels tell us people kept returning to the same sacred point even as time, mud, weather, and dynastic change covered older surfaces. In other words, the people of southern Mesopotamia were skilled at preserving a place through rebuilding. If some older tradition had once existed, not in exact architectural form, but in remembered pattern, Eridu is exactly the sort of place where such a pattern would survive. And then there is the king list. Few texts feel stranger on first reading. It begins with kingship descending from heaven. That sentence alone should make any careful reader slow down. Kingship does not merely appear. It descends. It comes from elsewhere, from above, into the human field. Then it enters the first city, Eridu, and a king reigns there for what to us is an impossible span. Then another king. Then kingship is transferred to Bad Tibira, then to Larak, then Sippar, then Shuruppak. The reign lengths before the flood are enormous, absurd if read literally, but precise enough to suggest deliberate structure. These are not random fairy tale numbers tossed out in excitement. They are patterned, calculated, often sexagesimal in form, tied to the mathematical habits of Mesopotamia itself. That is one reason the text unsettles scholars so effectively. If it were simply chaotic fantasy, it would be easier to dismiss. But it has the cold spine of a ledger. City, king, years, transfer, city, king, years, transfer. Then finally, after Shuruppak, the line breaks the world in two. Then the flood swept over. I think it is impossible to overstate how much that line matters. Every formal rhythm in the text has trained the mind to expect continuation, and then the continuation is violently interrupted. The list does not say the world changed slowly. It does not say the cities faded. It says the flood swept over. A single sentence performing the work of civilizational amputation. When I read that line, I do not picture a decorative myth painted on a temple wall. I picture a scribe inheriting something very old and feeling obligated to carry it, even if he no longer fully understood its scale. Because that, too, is what scribal traditions do. They preserve things larger than the people preserving them. They hand forward memory in forms that sometimes outlast explanation. The king list survives in more than one witness. That matters as well. Different tablets, different copies, different settings. Yet the core antediluvian sequence stays stubbornly recognizable. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. This is not one accidental survival. It is a tradition. Of course, mainstream scholarship gives strong reasons to read the antediluvian section as ideological. Later dynasties wanted legitimacy. Linking their political order to a primordial heavenly beginning is exactly the kind of thing ancient states liked to do. The inflated reign lengths likely encode symbolic grandeur. All true, or partly true. But even then, the text still chooses real cities, arranged in a coherent order, and places a flood between that sequence and the restored historical world. Symbolic writing can still contain historical memory. In fact, it often does. The symbol is how memory survives when precision no longer can. And there is a second feature of the king list that people tend to glide past too quickly. After the flood, kingship descends again. Again. The post-flood world is not described as total novelty. It is described as restoration. The pattern existed before. Water interrupted it. Then the pattern returned. That is exactly the kind of language one might expect from a civilization rebuilding after trauma. Not inventing everything from nothing, but beginning again from a remembered model. You know that feeling when you try to rebuild a room after damage and instinctively put things back where they were, even if the walls have changed. That is what the post-flood logic feels like. The old order is gone in substance, but not in concept. The memory of where things belong survives. This is where the story grows more intimate. Because now we are no longer looking only at drowned architecture or grand flood theories. We are looking at a human act that repeats across millennia. Loss, then rebuilding according to a remembered pattern. It happens in families. It happens in towns after fire. It happens after war, after exile, after any disaster that leaves survivors with more memory than material. They rebuild from sequence. They rebuild from ritual. They rebuild from whatever they can still say in the dark to themselves. First this, then this, then this. The Sumerian tradition behaves like that. The 5 cities before the flood may not represent exact municipal continuity with some drowned northern shore. We cannot say that, not honestly, not yet, but they do feel like the preserved vertebrae of a remembered first world. Enough remains to keep the shape. Enough order remains that later generations could rebuild under its shadow. And that shadow stretches across more than one text. The Eridu Genesis gives the city sequence in a sacred frame. The king list gives it in administrative cadence. Together they create a pressure that is difficult to dismiss. There was a before world of cities, and the flood did not merely happen in it. It swept over it. Outside the tablets, archaeology deepens the unease rather than calming it. Eridu is real. Shuruppak is real. Their antiquity is real. The earliest phases of Mesopotamian urbanization do seem to arrive with startling complexity. Templates, planning, craft specialization, religious centers, scribal memory. Not all at once in a magical burst, of course, but with enough speed and enough sophistication that older inheritances are hard to rule out. The Sumerians themselves certainly did not speak as if they were inventing civilization from scratch. They wrote more like heirs than inventors. That may be the most haunting word in all of this. Heirs. Heirs to what? The underwater room near Sinop does not answer that. The prism in Oxford does not answer that. The fragmentary tablet from Nippur does not answer that. But all 3 lean toward the same silence, and the silence is shaped like a vanished beginning. For now, let the prism turn slowly in museum light. Let the list of impossible kings continue its measured rhythm. Let the words first city stay attached to Eridu like a tone that will not fade. And let the Black Sea keep its drowned room in the dark. Because once the king list has done its work, once it has forced us to take the antediluvian sequence seriously as memory shaped into order, the next thing we have to face is the water itself. Not only the poetic flood, the geological one. Because if an older shoreline world really did drown, then the Black Sea should still be carrying the trace of that event in its floor, its chemistry, its drowned terraces, its buried human spaces. The tablets have brought us to the edge. The next step is to lower ourselves again beneath the surface and ask whether the basin itself still remembers how the waters entered and how fast they came. The Black Sea looks self-contained on a modern map, almost calm in its shape, as though it has always known exactly where it ends and what kind of water it holds. But maps are only the latest skin laid over a place. Beneath them lie older coastlines, older thresholds, older accidents, or not accidents, events. And the Black Sea, for all its quiet surface, carries one of the more unnerving possibilities in deep history. That possibility is simple enough to say and difficult enough to live inside. There may have been a time when the basin was a vast, lower freshwater lake, and then the world around it changed so severely that salt water broke through, and the shorelines people trusted disappeared. In the late 20th century, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman made that idea famous. Their model proposed that after the last ice age, as global seas rose, the Mediterranean eventually overtopped the Bosphorus barrier and poured into the lower Black Sea basin. Not a gentle seep, not a slow compromise, a violent marine incursion, enough to flood large tracts of former land and force human communities back from advancing water. Their work caught public attention immediately because it touched an old nerve. Catastrophic flood, lost coastlines, human witnesses, ancient memory. The model has been debated ever since, as it should be. Some scholars accept a dramatic influx. Others argue the process was slower, more complex, less cinematic. There are arguments over timing, arguments over water levels, arguments over whether the marine connection had earlier phases. Serious science often looks like this from the outside. Not one revelation, but a patient argument conducted over core samples, isotopes, shoreline, terraces, faunal changes, and sediments that only reveal their meaning reluctantly. Still, even when the strongest catastrophic version is moderated, a few points remain difficult to erase. The basin changed. Former land was inundated. Human settlement along those drowned margins is no longer speculative. Imagine that old landscape before the water rose high enough to take it. Do not picture only endless wilderness. Shorelines create concentration. They gather fish, birds, reeds, mud suitable for construction, roots for movement, clearings for houses. A freshwater lake of that scale would have drawn people the way all generous water draws them. Some lived close enough to hear small waves against the shore at night. Some built with what was near at hand: woven branches, packed earth, wooden frames, stone tools. Some buried memories into ordinary places without knowing they were making archaeology. Then the threshold changes. Water begins to behave differently. Perhaps the shoreline retreats from one season to the next. Perhaps salt begins to alter what had been familiar. Perhaps in some areas the rising is slow enough to be read as inconvenience. Then danger. Then doom. Even if the flooding was not one apocalyptic wall, it could still have been devastating in human terms. Humans do not experience a 500-year inundation as geologists do. They experience it village by village, field by field, grave by grave. One generation says the water is strange. The next says we had to move the house. The next says our fathers used to fish, where now there is only depth. That kind of catastrophe is perfect for myth because it is both gradual and absolute. Enough time exists for memory to spread and acquire symbolism. Enough destruction occurs that no one can simply go back and check the old shoreline once the transformation is complete. Ballard Discovery sits inside that tension. The structure off Sinop did not appear in empty sea by magic. It belonged to one of those drowned margins. The camera showed what looked like a built human space with wattle and daub walls preserved in the oxygen-poor depths. Nearby artifacts supported habitation. This was not the sea inventing forms in silt. This was a human place, now resting below the level where human breathing is possible. There is something almost unbearable about underwater domestic archaeology. Shipwrecks feel dramatic, even glamorous sometimes. A drowned shoreline dwelling feels more intimate. It suggests interrupted meals, interrupted sleep, interrupted ordinary life. No captain steering toward risk. Just people living where the future turned against them. And because the Black Sea deep waters preserve material so well, the scene becomes even more uncanny. Darkness and chemistry keep what air would have destroyed. The sea both murders and guards. It is almost too poetic, but there it is. The same water that erased the landscape also sealed its testimony. Some scholars resist any quick bridge between this kind of geology and the much later flood traditions of Mesopotamia. They are right to resist simplification. The dating does not align neatly with the classic Mesopotamian urban flood layers. The Sumerian texts were written thousands of years later than the earliest possible Black Sea marine transgression. Oral memory over such long spans is hard to prove. We should say that aloud. It keeps the room honest. Yeah, it is also true that human memory does not always preserve events as calendars. It preserves them as forms. Great water. Lost settlements. Old world before the flood. Surviving knowledge. Rebuilt life. Those forms can endure longer than precise dates. In fact, they often do. What I find most arresting is how well the Black Sea setting matches the emotional architecture of flood memory. A once habitable margin. A rising boundary between before and after. Human structures suddenly or gradually swallowed. The impossibility of return. The need to carry the old world forward in narrative. Ritual. And pattern because the land itself is gone. If you were standing here with me now, the fire would be quieter, and I would probably lower my voice without meaning to, because this is the moment where the past stops being decorative and starts feeling vulnerable. Imagine a community by that freshwater shore. Nets drying. Reed beds moving in wind. Clay walls warm from the day. Children used to the line where water ends. Then imagine watching that line cease to be trustworthy. Every morning a little farther, every season less familiar. The practical mind begins first. Move storage. Tie the boat higher. Shift the animals. Reinforce the wall. Then comes the more terrible realization. The shore itself is leaving. No wonder later people would speak of a flood that swept over. What other phrase could contain that kind of loss? There is another detail worth holding here, though it is quieter. Shoreline worlds often produce not only villages, but transmission corridors, trade, exchange, shared building habits, sacred sites facing water. If a substantial network once existed around portions of the older Black Sea margin, then its drowning would not merely remove houses. It would scatter people. Scattered people carry habits with them. They carry how to lay out rooms, how to honor water, how to rank settlement space, how to remember the lost homeland. Catastrophe does not only destroy, it exports. And that exported memory may explain why the Sumerian material sometimes feels less like invention and more like inheritance. A people arriving in a new river plain, or rising within one, does not need to preserve the exact plan of every vanished shore dwelling. It only needs to preserve the conviction that true order belonged to an earlier age, before a great interruption, and that civilization after the flood must be rebuilt in conscious relation to that older pattern. That is exactly how the antediluvian city traditions sound. The flood in the texts is not merely weather. It is a civilizational break. The world before it already had named places and organized rule. The world after it begins again, but not blindly. Kingship descends again. Cities are founded again. The pattern continues after interruption. That is almost the grammar of displaced survivors. Of course, even here, we should keep our hands steady. The Black Sea hypothesis is a frame, not a verdict. There were also real flood events in Mesopotamia itself. Local and regional inundations left sediment layers at sites like Shuruppak and Those matter, and later parts of the story will have to hold them carefully. The flood remembered by the Sumerians may not be one single event in the tidy way modern storytelling prefers. It may be a composite memory, an older drowned world folded together with later river catastrophe until one overwhelming sacred flood remained. Honestly, that possibility makes the story more believable, not less. Human beings remember through blending all the time. Several traumas merge into one master image. Several migrations become one ancestral journey. Several lost homes become one paradise before exile. The flood story could have deep roots in the Black Sea world and later branches in Mesopotamian disaster, all preserved together because the pattern of loss was recognizably the same. And the basin itself keeps contributing its own cold testimony. Marine surveys have revealed drowned shorelines, former terraces, submerged channels. The seafloor is not an abstract bowl. It is an overwritten landscape. If the water were removed, parts of it would read like a memory of land rather than the floor of a permanent sea. That alone should humble us. Places we call natural in one age may be the graveyards of ordinary human space in another. Ballard team knew this. They were not chasing fairy tale treasure. They were reading a basin. When their remote systems touched that preserved dwelling, what surfaced was not proof of Sumerian history. It was something more dangerous than proof. It was plausibility. And plausibility is often what keeps a mystery alive long enough for better questions to be asked. Because once a drowned house is real, the antediluvian city lists stop sounding absurdly remote. Once a shoreline can vanish, the old sentence, "then the flood swept over," becomes less literary and more human. Once a lost margin is confirmed, even partially, the possibility that a civilization preserved memory of a pre-flood world no longer belongs only to mythology. It belongs to the long, uneasy border where geology and story begin to recognize one another. So let the sea darken around that underwater room again. Let the camera light fade across its walls. Let the thought settle that somewhere, perhaps over many generations, people climbed inland from a drowning lake and carried with them more than tools. They carried sequence, sacred order, the ache of a before world, the knowledge that places can disappear while patterns remain. And now, once that has been allowed to breathe, the next move becomes necessary. We have seen the drowned margin. We have listened to the Sumerian lists. We have felt the floodline grow less abstract. But a harder question waits just beyond it. If the first cities after the flood were rebuilt from memory, what exactly was remembered? Not only names, not only catastrophe, form itself. Sacred form, the kind of form that later appears most clearly at Eridu, where water, sanctuary, and civilizational order all meet in one place. That is where the story turns next, into the earliest temple grammar of the first city, and into the possibility that what the sea swallowed was not just land, but the first model of how a human world should be built. The first time people built at Eridu, they did not build upward toward glory. They built inward toward meaning. That is one of the details I keep returning to, because it changes the mood of the whole mystery. When modern people hear the phrase, first city, they often imagine walls, crowds, markets, tall structures, noise, ambition. But the earliest Eridu that archaeology can actually touch is quieter than that. A small, sacred building, mud brick, a carefully marked interior, water close by, offerings, repetition. When excavators worked through the mound in the 20th century, they found not one temple, but a sequence, one phase resting over another, each later generation choosing to build again on the same point. 18 major building levels have been counted there. Later rooms grew larger. Plans became more elaborate. The settlement around the sacred center changed, but the old instinct remained. Return here. Build here. Keep this place alive. If you were standing there with me at dawn, before the heat rises too hard off the soil, you would not see a mountain of stone like Egypt. You would see a low tell, shaped by centuries of mud, brick, decay, and rebuilding, almost modest until you understand what it means. It means continuity. It means that a location can become more than useful. It can become necessary. That is exactly how Eridu behaves in the texts as well. In the old Sumerian imagination, Eridu is Titu Enki, Lord of Wisdom, Craft, Fresh Water, and the hidden deep beneath the earth called the Abzu. The city is not simply near water. It is conceptually born from the meeting of sacred order and life-giving depth. Its temple is not just a religious building. It is a kind of hinge between visible civilization and the unseen reservoir that nourishes it. Even now, that idea feels unexpectedly sophisticated. The first city is not imagined as raw dominance over land. It is imagined as alignment, a place built correctly at the edge of sustaining water. That matters when we bring the Black Sea ruin back into view. Because the structure off Sinop also belonged to a water-edge world. It rested where a habitable shoreline once existed. Wattle and daub. Domestic or communal architecture. A room built from local materials in a zone of marsh, lake margin, or quast. No, that does not make it a temple, and we should not pretend it does. Some scholars would stop the comparison right there and say we are crossing too quickly from architectural similarity to civilizational continuity. They would have a point. A wall of woven branches and mud is not rare in human history. But the story grows heavier when the comparison widens from material alone to setting and meaning. In both the drowned Black Sea margin and the earliest Eridu horizon, water is not background scenery. It is the condition of settlement. It structures where life gathers. It shapes the mind of the place. And in Sumerian memory, the first city before the flood is the city of sacred waters. The oldest urban order begins at the edge of the deep. That is the sort of detail that does not prove anything and yet refuses to leave the room. It lingers. Eridu also teaches us something else. Civilizational memory does not need intact monuments to survive. It can persist through pattern. A shrine rebuilt on the same axis, a basin in the same relation to a room. A repeated sense that this patch of ground must remain the place where human order touches something older and more sustaining than itself. If a drowned world had once possessed its own sacred shoreline centers, later survivors would not need to carry every brick south. They would only need to remember how the first meaningful place should feel. The Sumerian texts suggest exactly that kind of inheritance. There is a concept that appears again and again in Mesopotamian thought. The me. The word is difficult to flatten into one English equivalent. It can mean divine powers, civilizational principles, ordained functions, the operative patterns that make ordered life possible. Kingship is a me. Priesthood is a me. Craft, writing, music, ritual, judgment, social authority, all can be named as me. In later stories, the me are held by Enki and transferred to Inanna, a mythic narrative. Yes, but one structured around an extraordinary idea. Civilization is made of transferable patterns. It is not improvised from nothing every time. I have always found that one of the most haunting concepts in the ancient world. The first city in Sumer is not great because it invented everything out of air. It is great because it is custodian of the deep grammar of ordered life. The source of civilization in these texts feels more like guardianship than invention. Once that idea settles in, the antediluvian city lists start sounding different. They are no longer merely saying there were cities before the flood. They are implying that ordered human life existed in a form complete enough to be named, remembered, ranked, and later restored. The flood interrupts that order, but it does not erase the possibility of rebuilding because the pattern survives. And this is where Shuruppak enters with a different kind of voice. If Eridu is the city of foundation and sacred origin, Shuruppak is the city of transmission. It is the last city before the flood in the king lists, and it also survives in one of the oldest pieces of wisdom literature we possess, the Instructions of Shuruppak. The text is framed as father-to-son teaching, practical advice, moral counsel, social behavior, speech, property, self-control, all handed down in compact lines. It is not a flood text in the obvious sense, yet I think it belonged naturally here because it preserves the same civilizational instinct. What matters most when a world is unstable is what can be taught clearly enough to survive. A father speaks. A son listens. Order is compressed into sayings that can cross time. That may be the most human image in this entire investigation. Not kings. Not Templars. Not the sea swallowing a shore. A parent trying to make sure the next generation receives enough of the world to live in it wisely. Shuruppak in the flood traditions becomes the city of the survivor. In Atrahasis and the later flood stories, the chosen human who receives warning is linked to that same urban memory. Again, this does not prove a Black Sea origin, but it deepens the overall structure. The Sumerian flood tradition does not imagine survival as mere biological escape. It imagines survival as the carrying forward of ordered life, instruction, sacrifice, craft, and city memory. That is why Atrahasis matters here so much. The Atrahasis narrative, preserved in Akkadian but drawing on older Mesopotamian tradition, tells of divine frustration with humanity, then flood, then chosen survival. Some parts feel theological, some political, some almost bureaucratic. But one thing remains striking. The flood does not conclude the possibility of civilization. The survivor is warned. A vessel is built. Knowledge is acted upon. After the waters recede, life resumes under altered conditions. In other words, the story assumes that a world can be destroyed and yet still continue through transmitted memory. You can feel how close that is to the Black Sea question. Suppose a broad freshwater shoreline world was drowned, whether rapidly or through a terrible series of rising stages. Suppose human communities moved from that loss carrying stories of old settlements, old sacred places, old ways of ordering life around water. Suppose those migrants or their descendants later entered, merged with, or influenced developing southern societies. What would survive first? Probably not precise maps. Probably not municipal archives. What would survive is sequence, sacred pattern, practical instruction, foundation logic, flood memory, the conviction that civilization once existed in a more original form before the waters came. That is almost exactly what the Sumerian material gives us. And yet the tone of the texts remains so calm. I think that may be what makes them unsettling. They do not sound like people dramatizing trauma for effect. They sound like people inheriting a traumatized order and treating it as the normal framework of history. First cities. Kings before the flood. The flood swept over. Kingship descended again. Rebuild. Teach the sun. Preserve the me. If you were listening to this in a temple school at Nippur 4,000 years ago, it might not even strike you as mysterious. It would simply be the architecture of memory in which all later life was already living. There is also a theological humility in this ancient way of speaking. The texts do not say that humanity invents itself after catastrophe through raw genius. They say that ordered life is received, restored, granted, remembered. That differs sharply from the modern fantasy that civilization emerges cleanly through progressive improvisation. In Mesopotamian thought, civilization always seems to come with ancestry. It has a before. It has custodians. It has sacred weight. That is why I keep returning to the word heirs. Eridu is an heir. Shuruppak is an heir. Even post-flood kingship is heir to a pre-flood pattern. The tablets do not present Sumer as the absolute beginning of human order. They present it as the place where the surviving pattern became visible again in written form. And once you hear that, the underwater room off Sinop becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a possible fragment of the inheritance before inheritance had a name. Not a direct ancestor we can prove. Not a lost city we can label too quickly. But a piece of an older world where humans already knew how to build beside water. Already knew how to anchor life to a margin. Already knew enough to make the loss of such a place unforgettable. There is a scene I keep seeing in my mind, and maybe you see it too by now. A dim room beneath the sea, preserved in black water. A small shrine at Eridu under marsh light, built over and over on the same spot. A father in Shuruppak speaking careful instructions to a son. A scribe in Nippur pressing wedges into clay so the order of cities before the flood will not vanish. None of these scenes proves the others, but together they make a kind of pressure system, and inside that pressure system, the idea of pure invention starts to feel weak. What we may be looking at instead is transmission. Transmission through disaster, through migration, through ritual rebuilding, through small teachings preserved because large worlds can disappear. The first city, then, is not only a place. It is an act of remembering correctly. And once that possibility is allowed, the story has to turn toward the places where memory and geology overlap most sharply. Not only the sacred pattern, but the actual flood layers in Mesopotamia, because there were real river catastrophes there too, and those layers complicate everything. They make the tradition richer, messier, and perhaps more truthful. A drowned northern shore. A later Euphrates disaster. Several wounds merging into one civilizational master story. That is where we go next. Into the local flood deposits at places like Shuruppak and Ur, and into the hard, unsettling possibility that the great flood of the tablets is not one event remembered perfectly, but many waters folded together until one sentence could carry them all. Then the flood swept over. By the time we reach the flood layers of Mesopotamia, The story has already grown complicated in the best possible way. We have a drowned structure in the Black Sea. We have antediluvian city lists in Sumerian texts. We have Eridu, where sacred urban continuity can be touched in the ground itself. We have the me, those strange, deep principles of civilization preserved as though they were inherited rather than invented. And now archaeology in southern Iraq adds another fact: stubborn and physical. Water really did destroy settlements there too. At Shuruppak, excavators found a distinct flood deposit between occupational levels. Leonard Woolley famously identified a thick layer of clean alluvial silt and believed he had uncovered evidence of the flood itself. Later, scholars complicated that claim. Quite sensibly, Woolley had not found proof of a universal event. He had found a major inundation in one place. Other sites showed different sequences. Some had flood deposits. Some did not. Some aligned poorly in time. The plain of Mesopotamia floods, and it has done so again and again. That is not controversial. The harder question is how one or more local or regional floods became the great flood of tradition. This is the point where I think the story becomes more credible, not less, because real memory is rarely tidy. A culture does not always carry separate disasters in separate boxes for 5,000 years. It blends. It selects. It layers. A severe river flood in one generation can merge with an older inherited story of a more ancient drowning somewhere else. Over centuries, the events fold into one master catastrophe, one flood that explains why cities before the flood feel different from the world after it. To a modern historian, that may sound imprecise. To a civilization preserving trauma through oral and scribal memory, it sounds almost inevitable. Imagine the plain after a Euphrates flood. Mud-coating courtyards, reed fences torn open, grain stores spoiled, shrine floors silted over, a family returning to where a room used to be and finding only stain and debris. Even without the Black Sea, that alone would be enough to generate stories of world-breaking water. Add to it older inherited tales from a drowned northern margin. Tales perhaps already centuries old by the time they entered southern tradition. And the final literary flood begins to feel like a convergence rather than a fabrication. Shuruppak is especially important here because it is both a real city and a flood city in the textual tradition. The archaeological site shows occupation. The texts remember it as the last city before the flood and the city linked to the survivor. That overlap is not proof of one perfect event, but it is too precise to ignore. Memory and ground are touching, even if imperfectly. There is something deeply human in that imperfection. Modern people often want either total confirmation or total dismissal. Ancient material rarely offers either. What it gives instead is a texture of convergence. A city remembered in text. A city found in mud, brick, and sherds. A flood layer in the right, broad cultural zone. A survivor story attached to that place. It is enough to keep the question honest and alive. And then there is Ur. Woolly excavation became famous because the flood layer seemed dramatic and because the wider world loves nothing more than the possibility that archaeology has touched an old sacred story. But what stayed with more careful readers was not the temptation to overclaim. It was the reminder that the Mesopotamian lowlands really were vulnerable to catastrophic inundation. Not metaphorically, physically. The river world could and did erase the work of years in one season. In such a landscape, flood memory would not be literary garnish. It would be part of the emotional weather of civilization itself. You know that feeling when a place carries the memory of one old disaster so completely that even ordinary life there develops under its shadow. That is how Mesopotamia begins to feel. The cities are real and practical and administrative. Yet underneath them lies this old knowledge that water can take a world away. This is why the antediluvian sections of the King List are so powerful. They do not merely remember water. They remember a whole order of named cities before water. Local floods alone do not fully explain that. But local floods help explain why an older inherited catastrophe would remain believable, spiritually charged, and culturally central. Every later inundation would feel like an echo. Every layer of silt would reactivate the older memory. And so, the Great Flood becomes not less historical, but multiply historical. Some scholars dislike language like that because it seems to soften precision. I understand that. We cannot claim more than the evidence allows. But the evidence does allow this. The flood tradition preserved in Sumerian and Akkadian texts could easily be composite, with one part rooted in real Mesopotamian river disasters and another part preserving memory of an older drowned landscape beyond the plain. That framework accounts for more data than either pure invention or naive literalism. It explains why the flood is attached to real cities. It explains why the King Lists preserve a pre-flood sequence with such persistence. It explains why archaeology in the South finds flood deposits, but not one single universal layer everywhere. It explains why a Black Sea drowned structure can feel so hauntingly relevant without becoming a forced one-to-one match. And then the numbers return. The antediluvian rains are impossible. Yes, but they are not meaningless. Their mathematical structure suggests ordered transmission, sexagesimal logic, deliberate scaling. The scribes were shaping memory through number, not abandoning reason. That too fits a composite tradition. When oral catastrophe becomes scribal history, it is often formalized. Numbers expand. Symbolique grandeur entière. Yet the place names remain. The flood remains. The break remains. The old line keeps waiting. Then the flood swept over. At this point in the night, I find myself thinking less about proof and more about weight. What exactly is the weight of all these clues together? A drowned shoreline building in the Black Sea. Geological evidence that dry land became sea. Sumerian texts that preserve 5 real pre-flood cities. Eridu as first city and keeper of civilizational order. Shuruppak as both archaeological place and flood memory site. Mesopotamian flood deposits showing that catastrophic water really did shape the lived experience of the plain. The answer, I think, is that the weight is too great for easy dismissal and too uneven for easy certainty, which is perhaps why the story has lasted so long. Because the best mysteries are not empty. They are overfull. Too many things line up. Not perfectly. Perfectly is for fiction. They line up in that ancient, frustrating way that makes the mind circle back again and again. I have always found it almost funny, in the dark scholarly sense of funny, that the modern world tends to trust mud more than memory, right up until memory starts matching the mud. Then everyone gets nervous. But that nervousness may be healthy. It means we are near something real enough to resist simplification. There is another phrase in Mesopotamian tradition that belongs here, one that hovers around later flood, material, and deep geographical imagination. The mouth of the rivers. In later epic settings, it marks a liminal place where world and water meet, where journeys move toward extremity, where memory feels older than the city itself. I do not want to press the phrase too hard, but I cannot ignore how well it resonates with the Black Sea Basin as a receiving place of river systems, a broad northern margin that could once have felt like the end of an inhabitable world. If later tradition preserved even a distorted memory of such a basin, filtered through southern river culture and centuries of retelling, it would sound exactly like the flood narratives often sound, at once local and too large to be merely local. That may be why the flood story feels different from ordinary myth. It is not airy. It is muddy. It smells of riverbanks, bitumen, wet wood, sealed vessels, ruined fields, drowned names. Even when the divine enters it, the physical world remains stubbornly present. Flood myths in many cultures float into symbolism quickly. Mesopotamian flood texts stay administrative. Build this. Seal that. Take these. Leave those. Water rises. Cities are gone. Order must be resumed. That administrative quality may be the deepest clue of all. It suggests that the story was carried not only by poets, but by people whose job was to preserve the mechanics of continuity after interruption. Scribes, priests, builders, teachers, those are exactly the people who would understand that after catastrophe, the world survives by pattern, not by inspiration alone. Someone has to remember how to divide fields, how to count grain, how to set an altar, how to mark authority, how to teach the child, how to begin again. That is what the flood tradition protects. Not merely the memory of terror, but the procedures of renewal. And suddenly the Black Sea room is no longer lonely. It belongs to a whole emotional civilization of beginning again. A room under water. A shrine rebuilt in marshland. A list of cities before the flood. A father teaching a son. A scribe formalizing impossible old reigns so the break in history cannot be forgotten. These are all acts of resistance against erasure. If you were here with me now, I would probably let the silence sit for a second. Because this is the point where the story becomes less about whether one single theory wins and more about what kind of past humanity was trying to preserve. Not a fantasy kingdom. A lost order. A world in which the first cities already existed. Then water came. Then survivors carried enough of that world forward to rebuild. No, we still cannot prove that the Black Sea Basin was the original homeland of the antediluvian tradition. No one honest should say so. But we can say something stronger than simple speculation. The convergence between drowned landscapes, real flood archaeology, Sumerian pre-flood city memory, and civilizational restoration traditions is now rich enough that the old dismissal, "It is only myth," sounds thinner than it once did. The horizon runs underwater, through museum drawers, and across the tells of Iraq, where flood silt meets temple foundations. None of these archives is complete. All of them are patient, because the earth keeps opening slowly. Another core sample, another sonar pass, another excavation square, another fragment translated correctly after sitting a century in storage. History often changes not through one shout, but through several quiet confirmations arriving years apart until the old confident story can no longer hold. For now, let the flood remain what the evidence allows it to be, a composite memory of catastrophic water, rooted in real destruction, possibly reaching back to drowned northern shores older than Sumer itself, and preserved by the first civilization that learned to write its fear and its inheritance into clay. That leaves us with one final movement still ahead after tonight, and it is perhaps the most delicate of all. We have to gather the strands without forcing them. The numbers, the phrase "at the mouth of the rivers," the 5 cities, the drowned room off Sinop, the Mesopotamian flood layers, the old sacred idea that civilization is not invented from nothing, but restored from a pattern surviving catastrophe. All of that now waits to be drawn together under one last light, not to end the mystery, but to show why it has never really gone away. By now, the story has become too dense for any honest person to pretend it is simple. That is usually the moment when a good mystery becomes worth keeping. Easy stories flatter the listener. Difficult stories change the listener a little. And this one, with its cold water, old clay, drowned shorelines, sacred city patterns, impossible rain lengths, and flood layers in the mud of Iraq, has reached the point where it can no longer be held inside one safe sentence. So we do what the evidence itself forces us to do. We slow down. We gather the paths separately. We let each one speak in its own voice before we ask whether they belong to the same buried world. The first path is the strict scholarly one, the most cautious, the one that keeps its boots clean and its hands folded until the ground is absolutely firm. In that reading, the antediluvian cities of the king list are literary constructions. They are not memories of actual pre-flood urban centers in the deep past. They are part of a Mesopotamian ideological architecture, a way for later scribes to push kingship into sacred antiquity, to make the present feel anchored by an unimaginably old order. The impossible rain lengths support that reading. So does the formal mathematical patterning. So does the clear symbolic logic of a world divided by flood into before and after. There is strength in that position. It protects us from romantic overreach. It reminds us that ancient texts are not modern archives. They shape, they elevate, they mythologize. They do not simply report. Anyone listening carefully has to grant that. Some of the old numbers are too deliberate, too stylized, too beautifully inflated to be read like a census ledger. The scribes knew exactly what they were doing. They were not confused. They were composing sacred history. But even that severe reading has to live with certain irritations. Because the literary construction is not built from nowhere. It names real cities. It preserves the same city sequence across different witnesses. It attaches the flood break to places that archaeology can touch. Eridu is real. Shuruppak is real. Sipper is real. The formula may be literary, but the names are not decorative. That makes the cautionary reading solid, but not complete. It tells us that the material is shaped. It does not quite explain why it is shaped around such persistent and specific urban memory. The second path is gentler and, to me, more human. This is the memory model. It accepts literary shaping, symbolic numbers, theological framing, and still argues that something historical survives inside the form. Not exact chronology, not a perfect preserved report, but memory. A culture remembers catastrophe through compression. It condenses many details into a few unforgettable structures. Before the flood, there were cities. The flood swept over. The world resumed, but altered. Kingship descended again. Order had to be rebuilt. This reading does not demand that every name in the list be a direct eyewitness fossil. It only asks us to consider that the literary structure may be carrying a very old civilizational wound. That reading feels persuasive because it matches how human beings actually remember loss. We do not preserve everything. We preserve the break. We preserve the places that mattered. We preserve the sequence that helps us say this happened. Then everything changed. A shoreline community displaced by water would remember that. A river civilization repeatedly wounded by inundation would remember that too. And when one memory met another, the result could become exactly the kind of flood tradition the Sumerians wrote down. I have always found that second path the most emotionally credible because it leaves room for both discipline and grief. It does not force the tablets to be modern documents. It does not reduce them to pure fiction either. It says that myth is often history after the edges have softened, but before the center has died. Then there is the third path, the most dangerous one, or perhaps the most intoxicating, depending on the mood of the person listening. This is the speculative Black Sea continuity model. In its strongest form, it suggests that settlements once existed around the lower Black Sea margin before inundation, that their destruction became part of a long inherited memory, and that this memory, perhaps carried by migrants or by transmitted sacred order, later contributed to the Sumerian antediluvian city tradition. In other words, the oldest flood history on clay may preserve an echo of a drowned northern world. That path is where most careful scholars step back, and understandably, we do not have direct proof of Ubaid or proto-urban Black Sea settlements tied conclusively to Sumerian culture. We do not have inscriptions from the drowned shore saying we are one of the first 5 cities. Thank you for finding us at last. We do not have an unbroken chain of documentation leading from Sinop to Eridu. There are gaps, very large gaps. Any honest storyteller has to say that aloud and let it remain in the room. And yet, the Black Sea Basin really did include habitable land now underwater. Ballard really did find a human-built structure beneath the sea. Ancient Mesopotamian texts really do remember pre-flood cities in ordered sequence. Eridu really does stand at the beginning of that sequence as a sacred water city. Flood deposits really do exist in Mesopotamia, even if they are not universal, and even if they represent regional events rather than one single global catastrophe. The pieces do not prove the strongest speculative thesis, but they do make it difficult to laugh away. That is the uncomfortable place where good history often lives. Not in proof, not in fantasy, in pressure. The more I sit with the evidence, the more I think the pressure comes from convergence rather than direct correspondence. The Black Sea model does not need to explain every detail of the Sumerian flood tradition to matter. It only needs to show that a drowned shoreline world, capable of generating lasting catastrophe memory, really existed. Once that is granted, the antediluvian texts begin to sound less isolated. They stop floating alone in theological abstraction. They become one expression, perhaps the most powerful one, of a larger human archive of flood memory. And then the Mesopotamian flood layers complicate everything again in a way that feels almost merciful. Because complication is often where truth hides. Shuruppak shows evidence of flooding. Shows a dramatic flood deposit. Other sites reveal their own watery interruptions, or do not. The chronology does not line up neatly into one universal event. But that may be exactly the point. The flood tradition was likely composite, a northern drowned world. If such a memory truly survived, would have been reinforced by later southern river catastrophes. Each fresh inundation would reactivate the old pattern. Each rebuilding phase would deepen the conviction that civilization had once been broken by water and then restored. That is why the king list sounds so composed. It is not describing a panic. It is describing a framework. Civilization existed. Water interrupted it. The pattern resumed. That framework could have absorbed many real disasters over time without losing its old center. You know that feeling when a family carries one old story of loss for generations, and every new sorrow attaches itself to it until the story becomes larger than the original event. That may be what happened here. A primary flood memory, perhaps older than Sumer itself, became the vessel into which later Mesopotamian floods were poured. The result was not confusion. The result was a civilization-scale memory system. This may also explain why the texts remain so practical. The flood stories are not merely visions of terror. They are manuals of continuity. Build the vessel. Preserve the line. Re-establish kingship. Carry knowledge forward. Teach the son. Restore sacrifice. Rebuild the city. These are the instincts of people who know that survival depends not only on bodies, but on forms. Which brings us back, inevitably, to the me. Those transferable civilizational powers or principles. The more the flood tradition is read against the me, the less it feels like a story of total beginning, and the more it feels like a story of interrupted inheritance. Civilization after the flood is not fresh invention. It is recovered order. Whether that recovered order came from southern river memory alone, or from a deeper drowned inheritance as well, is the open question. But the grammar is the same. Restore what was lost. Reinstall what belonged to the world before water crossed the line. And so part 7 of this long investigation becomes a place of weighing. On one side, strict caution. Literary ideology. Symbolic, deep time. political theology. On another side, encoded catastrophe memory. Real places, real water, preserved through mythic structure. On the furthest side, the possibility that the Black Sea shelf, now cold and dark below the surface, once held part of the sacred world that later Southern scribes remembered only as the age before the flood. I do not think we need to choose brutally between them to be truthful. In fact, I think the best reading may take something from all three. The antediluvian lists are literary, certainly. They are also probably mnemonic vessels of catastrophe memory. And those memories may, just may, reach further back than the river plains of historical Sumer, toward drowned landscapes now lying under northern water. If you were here with me, I would probably let the fire settle low before saying the next part, because it is the quietest and perhaps the most important thing the evidence has taught us. The past does not always survive as fact or fiction. Sometimes it survives as alignment, text and mud, numbers and drowned rooms, sacred city patterns and marine terraces, non-identical, all leaning in the same direction. That direction is enough to change the mood of the entire story. The flood is no longer just a tale of punishment. It becomes a record of civilizational discontinuity. The first cities are no longer just legendary names. They become remembered stations in a lost order. The Black Sea ruin is no longer an isolated underwater curiosity. It becomes a witness, however partial, that human worlds on drowned margins truly existed. And Sumer itself becomes not the first invention of civilization from empty soil, but perhaps the first written restoration of something older, something already broken once by water before it reached clay. That does not end the mystery. It sharpens it. Because once you allow all of this to stand together, the final movement of the story changes from argument to return. We have to go back to the tablets themselves, back to the measured numbers, the formulas, the phrase at the mouth of the rivers, the little wedge marks carrying too much memory, back to the drowned room under black water, back to the old unnerving possibility that the first great archives of humanity were trying, with all the tools they had, to keep alive the shape of a world already gone when they wrote it down. At the end of a long investigation, I always find myself returning not to the loudest claim, but to the smallest surviving object, a core sample, a shard, a phrase, a room underwater. Because deep history does not usually leave us with monuments broad enough to banish doubt. It leaves us with fragments that continue to behave as if they belong together. And in this story, the fragments are patient in a way I find almost unnerving. There is the prism in Oxford, dense with wedge marks, carrying the impossible old rains and the city sequence before the flood. There is the broken tablet from Nippur, with its damaged but still legible memory of first cities and overwhelming water. There is Eridu, low and layered, returning again and again to the same sacred point beside the marsh. There is Shuruppak, both a real site and a remembered threshold. There are flood deposits in Mesopotamian mud. And far away to the north there is the drowned structure off Sinop, a human room preserved beneath cold Black Sea. When these things are kept separate, each can be filed away. A literary artifact, a geological event, an archaeological anomaly, a temple sequence, a flood layer, a king list. But when they are allowed to sit in the same dim room together, when the light falls over all of them at once, the mood changes. The pieces begin acting less like strangers and more like witnesses who have forgotten parts of one shared sentence. That shared sentence may never be reconstructed cleanly. We should accept that. The past is not obliged to resolve itself into our preferred level of certainty, but it can still be listened to well. Take the numbers again. The antediluvian rain lengths are absurd if treated as ordinary biography, yet they are not careless. They are ordered, structured, mathematically shaped according to Mesopotamian number sense. That matters because it means the scribes were formalizing memory, not merely decorating it. The numbers transform the before world into sacred deep time. Yes, but sacred deep time built around real city names and a consistent flood break. That combination feels deliberate in the strongest sense. These are not childish exaggerations. They are a way of saying that what came before the flood belonged to a different scale of reality. And perhaps that is exactly how drowned prehistory would feel to later civilizations. Not accessible in detail, but heavy, enlarged, almost immeasurable. A before world, a larger age, a sacred old order. Then there is the phrase that hovers around later flood tradition, the mouth of the rivers. It is not a phrase we should abuse. It does not solve the mystery on its own, but it has the right kind of atmosphere. River systems feeding toward a broad receiving basin. A liminal geography where inland water meets something larger and more final. If some ancient inherited memory of a drowned northern basin survived into later Mesopotamian imagination, it would sound like that. A place at the mouths of rivers, somewhere both geographical and threshold-like, where the world before catastrophe had once stretched outward, and then the Black Sea returns. Not as proof. I want to keep saying that, because proof is the wrong word and the wrong mood. The sea returns as physical permission. Permission to take drowned human landscapes seriously. Permission to imagine that communities once stood where sonar now moves. Permission to hear flood tradition not as primitive fantasy, but as something that may have been anchored, at least in part, in real geological violence. I have always thought that one of the stranger habits of modern thought is that it trusts catastrophe in science and distrusts catastrophe in memory until the two start overlapping. Then it becomes uncomfortable, but perhaps discomfort is appropriate. The overlap between Black Sea inundation, Mesopotamian flood memory, antediluvian city traditions, and archaeology of real flood-damaged southern cities is not neat enough to flatter us. It is only strong enough to keep us awake, which may be exactly what it should do. Because this story is not really about proving one spectacular claim. It is about recovering the dignity of old memory. The Sumerians were not fools pressing fantasies into clay. They were scholars of their own deep past, working with the tools available to them, preserving city names, sequences, ritual frameworks, and catastrophe grammar as faithfully as they could. Whether they fully understood the age depth of what they carried is almost beside the point. They knew enough not to discard it. That is what gives the tablets their peculiar authority. They are not casual myth. They are disciplined remembrance. And the earth, strangely, has begun to answer them in its own slower language. Not with total clarity. With hints, a drowned shoreline here, a flood deposit there, a real first city in the place where the texts say one stood, a final flood city that also exists as an archaeological site. Layer by layer, the world below the story begins to rise just enough to trouble dismissal. If you were standing here with me now, I think this would be the point where the whole room feels a little quieter than before. The fire lower, the air softer, the investigation no longer moving outward in excitement, but inward in recognition. Because the greatest thing these fragments suggest is not that we have found Atlantis in the Black Sea, or that every line of ancient flood narrative has suddenly become literal reportage. The greatest thing they suggest is subtler and, to me, more haunting. Human civilization may have begun not with simple ascent, but with recovery, with rebuilding after water, with sacred order preserved through interruption. That possibility changes the emotional center of the story. It means the first cities in writing are already second beginnings. It means the archives of Sumer may be preserving a civilization that knew itself as heir to loss. It means the flood is not only punishment or mythic spectacle. It is also a memory of discontinuity, a recognition that worlds can vanish and that what survives first is pattern. City sequence. Temple grammar. Instruction. Rule. Craft. The me. The ability to start again without pretending nothing happened. When I think of the room under the Black Sea now, I no longer see only one house. I see a threshold, a surviving trace of a margin that became unlivable, a little witness to the fact that beneath some of our oldest written memories there may lie a deeper, unwritten catastrophe, not preserved in language at first, but in movement, in migratio, in sacred rebuilding, in the strange insistence that civilization had a beginning before the flood and another beginning after it. The more you sit with that, the more the Sumerian tradition feels less like an origin story and more like a restoration archive. That phrase is not scholarly jargon. It is just the most honest way I can say what the evidence feels like. An archive of restoration. A civilization remembering how to resume after the waters cross the line. And so we end where we began, with a camera lowering through black water. The research vessel is above. The sea is calm enough on the surface to seem innocent. The monitors glow in the darkened room. Far below, the old structure waits in silt, its walls still holding the shape of decisions made by hands that believed the shoreline would remain. Those people are gone. Their language is gone. Their names are gone. But the room remains. Then, in another world of light entirely, a museum drawer opens. Clay appears. Wedges pressed by a scribe who also believed some things should not be lost. The line of cities emerges. Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sipper, Shuruppak. Then the flood swept over. Between the underwater room and the clay line lies all the silence we have spent tonight walking through. Not empty silence, populated silence. full of drowned terraces, sacred rebuilding, repeated flood grief, impossible numbers, and the stubborn human refusal to let catastrophe erase the grammar of the world. Some scholars will keep the whole matter safely literary. Some will hear deep memory moving under the text. Some will look north and feel the pull of those drowned shelves beneath the Black Sea. I do not think the mystery requires us to choose one of those moods too quickly. It only asks that we listen long enough to notice that the oldest written civilization on Earth may have been trying to preserve the outline of something already ancient when it first came into view. That possibility is enough. Enough to make the tablets feel heavier in the hand. Enough to make the drowned room feel less lonely. Enough to make the phrase before the flood sound less decorative and more like a real human shiver passed through time until it hardened into writing. And perhaps that is the final truth this story offers, the gentlest and darkest one. The first histories of mankind may not have begun by celebrating a pristine dawn. They may have begun by looking backward through mud and memory, trying to describe a lost, shoreline world already swallowed when the scribes first pressed their signs into clay. The sea kept one fragment. The tablets kept another. We stand much later between them, listening to both, while below the black water the old rooms wait without speaking, and above them the oldest city names in the world remain lit under museum glass, still refusing to disappear. Before we let the story close, there is one more image worth holding, because it gathers almost everything without forcing it. Picture a survivor, not one named exactly as later tradition names him. Not a hero painted too brightly. Just a human being standing above changed water after the flood has done its work. Behind him, the old world is inaccessible. Ahead of him, the new world has not yet learned its own name. What can he carry? Not a city. Not a temple whole. Not the full memory of every shoreline. He carries sequence. He carries where the sacred place should be. He carries how authority should be recognized, how sacrifice should be ordered, how a son should be instructed, how the first room of a rebuilt world should face water and meaning at once. That is enough to begin again. That, to me, is what the Sumerian material feels like at its deepest level. Not the diary of one event frozen perfectly across millennia, but the preserved sequence of beginning again after the first world failed. The antediluvian cities are remembered because they were the stations of the old order. The flood is remembered because it severed that order. The post-flood cities matter because they are the attempt to restore it without forgetting the break. And once that thought settles in, the coldness of the Black Sea becomes almost unbearably poignant. A structure under dark water is no longer just an archaeological curiosity. It becomes an emblem of all the beginnings that never got to finish, all the rooms that became memory before their builders expected them to, all the shorelines that taught later peoples the terrible lesson that land itself can betray expectation. No wonder the first written civilization spoke with such gravity when it spoke of water. No wonder its oldest city traditions feel less triumphant than burdened. They may have inherited not the innocence of a first dawn, but the wisdom of survivors. Good night,